Hi, everyone. I'm going to kick us off with a presentation of some very new research by Jeff Gordon and I. And then I will introduce our distinguished panel, and he will hear their responses and then save some time for discussion and questions among all of us. So this is a paper about private equity that now commands a major and growing share of the real economy. So here's a chart that is telling this story in two different ways. We've got two different measures. The blue line is representing gross asset value, which is a measure of the equity ownership of private equity. You can see it's been trending up, and as of 2025, this figure represented approximately 17% of the market capitalization of the S&P 500. But we actually think the orange line is a better, although still understated measure of the economic impact of private equity. That shows the aggregate gross asset value of private equity controlled portfolio company investments. This is closer to enterprise value. And at year-end 2023, this measure was over $10 trillion. And again, this is understated because it's not including small filers that make up about 25% of private equity enterprise value. But by either measure, you can see that we're seeing the economic importance of private equity to the U.S. economy growing quite rapidly in the post-global financial crisis period. Okay, so thus far, scholars have focused on the risks to investors that come from the private equity model. And we instead focus on a different, and we think more pressing issue, which is the risk of economy-wide resource allocation. And this risk has become pronounced given the features of the private equity market that have led to diminished accountability. We've got four of these on the slide here that I can barely read. The first and the big one, the one that we're going to spend the most time on, is the reduced incidence of exits via arm's length sales, and an increased incidence of exits in conflict transactions to secondary buyers, to continuation funds. In addition, we've seen the GP income is now more and more composed of revenue that comes from from its income unlinked from performance. So instead of carried interest, we're getting just flat fees that are paid on the number of assets under management. We've also seen this change in the institutional environment that says, as a matter of prudent diversification, you need to invest in private equity, and this is going even further in the foreseeable future as there have been pushes to democratize private equity, as this current administration has been very receptive to, and also the measures of performance that exist are quite opaque and biased. Okay, so we think without accountability, there's a risk that private equity could be going in the same direction as the failed conglomerate experiment of the 60s and 70s, and that this could lead to inefficiency and harm on a wide scale. But the good news is we also think there's an easy solution in sight, and we propose that there should be mandatory company-level disclosure for the financials of significant portfolio companies. We think the costs associated with doing this are quite small because funds already produce this information to their creditors, and the benefits would be really large. It'll allow us to better understand whether this organizational experiment has been a success and to what degree. And this becomes all the more important as this industry prepares to open itself up to trillions of dollars from 401k investors. In the remainder of this time with you, I want to share some of the data that we've collected, and it's going to support this first point in bold about diminished accountability via arm's length exit. And I'll give you a little bit more content on our analogy to the conglomerate era, and then I'll conclude by giving some thoughts on our proposal. Okay, so exit is a really critical component of accountability in private equity. Particularly given what I've said about, we can't really measure private equity performance. What the industry produces, the measures of performance are biased and incomplete. Okay, so the need to exit by selling the company in an arm's length transaction is going to force private equity sponsors to submit to a process that's going to test their value creation thesis. And so this accountability via exit has broken down for private equity, and this is something that's been reported in the financial press, and we provide our own documentation of this problem with a study of public to private transactions from data available on PitchBook. And we focused on this segment because of its importance in the US economy, but also because we got slightly better, more complete data when we studied this subset of the market. And this leads me to one of our central findings in this empirical investigation is that it was very difficult to learn much about exits from the available data sources. Nobody's obligated to report to PitchBook, and so its coverage of exits is quite incomplete. So I don't want you to take away from this any definite statements, but we just wanted to show you some trends that we uncovered. Okay, so we'll start by showing you this. This is going to show us some exit data for, again, public to private acquisitions from 2000 to 2025. The blue line shows the percentage of deals for which we found an exit match. The red line tells us a little differently. It shows the fraction of entry value that's matched with an exit. And you can see under either measure, the match rate is sharply declining beginning in 2017, declining even further after that. It looks as though from this figure, exits come close to disappearing. Okay, so for the firms that do exit, we wanted to understand the holding period. How long are they staying under private equity ownership? And again, as we see private equity gaining assets under management in this post-global financial crisis period, the holding period, conditional on exit, is increasing. Okay, last figure for you all. We wanted to better understand the nature of exit, and we see here a significant shift away from sales to a strategic buyer, so those are the blue bars, towards secondary sales, which are the red bars, and continuation funds, which are yellow. IPOs are the orange. They made up a meaningful percentage of the exits in the early part of the period, and after 2016, they pretty much completely fall off. Okay, so with the caveat that we are working with imperfect data, the trends shown here put this accountability problem in bold relief. So as private equity is gaining ground, the rate of exit measured by both the number and value of acquisitions is declining. As this happens, the rate and quality of exit declines. And so even when you have exit, the holding period is increasing. And we really think this is a problem because exit is a critical component, again, a critical component of accountability for private equity. And if a significant fraction of private equity assets are being held for longer and longer or simply traded from pocket to pocket and sales fueled by an ever-increasing pool of money, there's no way to really test this thesis of value creation, the private equity thesis of value creation from its activities. And again, this is compounded by the other trends I mentioned before. Opaque and biased measures of performance, an increasing reliance on fees that are not tied to performance at all, and an influx of dollars from less discerning investors. Okay, so I'm going to hit on this point relatively quickly. We spend a lot of time in our paper discussing this analogy that private equity without accountability is going to run into this same problem of hubris at scale that undermined the conglomerate movement of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So in the conglomerate era, management failed to create value in their assemblage of unrelated businesses. And then the inadequacy of market-based mechanisms to check conglomeration led to massive resource misallocation. And we think that today the same mistakes are being made at the private equity fund level. So sponsors are assembling these vast portfolios of diverse companies under a general claim of value creation. But again, we don't have the information we need to assess that claim. And so in a data collection effort, we found evidence of hundreds of funds with investments across 24 different economic sectors. And so this is a little different. This is an analogy, but it's an imperfect one. We don't have a single person trying to oversee all of this business activity, but the private equity governance model in which you've got specialist teams at the sponsor level interacting with board members and managers at the portfolio companies across multiple business areas. Again, this raises similar concerns about managerial capacity that cropped up during this earlier period. Okay, so then I want to talk about what we think could be problematic in terms of resource misallocation and economic harm. So I've already hit on the first one here, the difficulty of managing across different businesses. There's also the need to manage liquidity needs of limited partners that can lead to some distortions. That need may produce recapitalizations at portfolio companies to generate distributions instead of further investment to generate more value increasing options. A related distortionary effect comes from the emphasis on debt utilization, which can lead to underinvestment and harm growth prospects. Another driver of resource misallocation that's really evocative of this earlier period, and in particular the flaws associated with the reliance on internal capital markets, is the use of the NAV loan. And so the NAV loan is secured by the value of the fund's equity ownership in the portfolio companies. It can be used for cash distributions to limited partners or for investment in the portfolio company that needs extra cash. These loans sit above the LP's equity but below debt issued by specific portfolio companies. And so it's kind of similar to debt issued by a conglomerate for general purposes throughout the conglomerate's life, including dividend payments. And so in this scenario, you may have portfolio companies competing for scarce investment capacity allocated by headquarters, which again can lead to these resource allocation distortions. Okay, so I want to be clear here that our argument is not that private equity is always going to lead to resource misallocation. It's simply that some percentage of this will, particularly as these accountability mechanisms has eroded, and when these inefficiencies manifest, investors and the broader public are not going to be aware of them under the existing regulatory landscape. Okay, so that gets to our proposal. We think, oh, sorry, the slide got goofed up, but we've got an answer we think that would be really responsive to this issue and do a lot of good here, which is to require disclosure for the significant private equity portfolio companies. And we're still playing with this and would love feedback on it. Our tentative threshold for disclosure is $5 billion in annual revenue, or the value marked by the private equity sponsor for NAV purposes at $2 billion, whichever is lower. We want to basically approximate the bottom end of the S&P 500 small cap S&P 500. The scope of disclosure, we think there should be audited financials, there should be an auditor's report, we should have some key corporate governance details. This should be done on an annual basis, absolutely. We're not sure about an 8K for material events. We think it could be a good idea, but we'd be curious to hear from all of you. And again, just to emphasize, this isn't actually that burdensome to do because the industry is already producing this, funds are producing this information for their creditors. We also think the SEC has the authority to do this. We don't have to wait for Congress to act here. So under Section 404 of the Dodd-Frank Act, it specifies that investment advisors shall keep and disseminate reports as necessary and appropriate in the public interest and for the protection of investors or for the assessment of systemic risk by FSOC. And the text and legislative history here suggests that this language should be read broadly and allow the SEC to mandate disclosure of this kind. And so the last thought here is we think this proposal is even more important now, given that we're in this moment where the Trump administration is aiming to open private equity to the $10 trillion retirement account market. So this influx of unsophisticated investors into private equity is not only going to contribute to this accountability deficit, it also means that ERISA fiduciaries are going to be facing a new terrain of private equity investments without all of the necessary information to navigate it. So it's hard to imagine that a trustee could discharge their duty of prudence without any information about the performance of portfolio companies that the funds are investing in. And so to summarize, we really think our disclosure proposal is vital to support the duties of trustees who are going to be navigating this new terrain. We also think it's important to respond to the prospect of allocative inefficiencies that come from this world of diminished accountability. Okay, so now I'm going to get out of the way and introduce our distinguished panel. So we're first going to hear from Josh Lerner, who's the Jacob H. Schiff Professor at Harvard Business School and the co-director of the HBS Private Capital Project. He's been recently recognized as among the 40 most influential economists worldwide by Scholar GPS and Research.com. Then we'll hear from William Clayton, a professor of law and associate dean for faculty and curriculum at BYU's J. Reuben Clark Law School. His research centers on corporate and securities law with a particular expertise in private markets and the governance of private equity funds. Next, Daniel Sirota is the global co-leader of Mayer Brown's financial services M&A practice. He represents clients in the technology, media, and telecommunications, financial institutions, fintech, healthcare, and e-commerce and retail industries. He's also a Columbia Law alum. Then William Birdthistle, a professor from practice at the University of Chicago Law School, where he focuses on investment funds, financial regulation, and corporate governance. Before that, he was director of the Division of Investment Management at the SEC. He's also the author of Empire of the Fund, The Way We Save Now. Last but not least, we have Norm Champ, who's a partner in the New York office of Kirkland & Ellis, where he heads the regulatory solutions practice in the investment funds group. Before that, he was a director of the Division of Investment Management at the SEC. Okay, so I will give Josh the mic, and I think, Josh, if you just click through, you'll get your slides.
First of all, thanks so much for the invitation to come here. It's very intimidating with such a collection of legal minds, and clearly this is not my strong suit, so I figured the safest bet was to nerd out, in the sense that whatever else you can say, probably no one can rival me in terms of private equity data nerding, and as such, I'll just sort of lead with my strength. But I think this was, certainly a provocative paper. There's a ton of stuff in it, and I felt like I could easily spend the 90 allotted minutes discussing all the issues here. I resisted the temptation and just said, let's just focus in on three things. But before we do that, it's worth just sort of highlighting that a lot of the stuff in this presentation is definitely true and, is unarguable with. There's certainly a lot more private equity than there used to be. The holding periods of companies under private equity ownership have definitely lengthened. And the way that private equity performance is measured is certainly not perfect. Though I'm going to have some caveats there. There are a few things that are perhaps a little more controversial and problematic. That is where I'm going to dwell. One of which has to do with this issue around, which is sort of central in the paper, which is about this notion that there's been some sort of decline in what's the author's term, quality of exits. And I'll just try to drill into both what we know about exits and how we interpret what's going on with exits as two of the points that I'll do there. And then also I think that the question around mandated disclosure and the match between the problem that the authors identify and the solution is something that I'll spend a few minutes on as well. But in general, I think that this is, raises a lot of really important questions. They have interesting data, but there's certainly a lot of food for thought and discussion. So without further ado, I will plunge in. All right, so the first thing that sort of really struck me as interesting/strange was the picture that got flashed on earlier in terms of the volume of exits. And one of the things that is very striking is not the colored stuff, but the light gray, which is the deals that have not been exited. And what's less disturbing is the stuff on the right, which says that, very new deals have not been exited. But as you look at deals, even going back, and my eyes are not good enough to see the font over here, but it looks like in the early 2000s, the chart is suggesting that somewhere on the order of 40% of the deals have not been exited. And this brings us to the question, that certainly intuitively, that seems like an awfully high number, especially saying, yes, funds can have extensions to their 10-year lives and extensions on extensions and so forth, but that still seems like a really big number to me. And as I thought about it, there was a couple things that jumped out at me. One of which is that they're doing this analysis using PitchBook data. We know and love PitchBook and have used it, but its real strength is for looking at venture capital, not looking at private equity. And our general experiences have been that what it tells, it's very selected and limited in terms of what it shows in terms of private equity. And that, some of the other data sources, Capital IQ, DealScan, and so forth, have much more coverage of private equity activity. The second issue, which is sort of related to this, is that the way in which all these commercial data vendors are basically collecting data is essentially a bit of a game of, it's a bit of a scavenger hunt. They clearly are hearing stuff from investment banks and have relationships with the banks that allow them to track what's taking place. They are clearly looking at securities filings, and whether Form Ds or 8Ks and other kinds of indicators. But essentially, there's a lot of activity, particularly as you get to the middle market, that really falls below the radar screen and doesn't really get identified there. And this is not to, cast aspersions on the authors. It's just really hard finding out what happens to this stuff. I mean, we've spent a lot of work over the last 15 years using in the sort of census IRS databases, and you'd think the one people would know what was going on is the IRS, because they're essentially getting annual tax filings. But even when you look at that data, their ability to really track what's taking place as you get just the recombination of assets and so forth is very limited. Similarly, as was sort of hinted at by the authors, the quality of LP reporting to LPs on portfolio companies, and we've done a lot. We just sort of wrapped up a project on reporting using the Stepstone data, which has served as a limited partner for many decades. The quality, the level of detail on individual portfolio firms is certainly not comprehensive. And even the stuff we've done looking at Delaware filings, where you'd think certificates of incorporation would trace all this stuff, is enormously difficult. So it's not to say that the authors have done anything wrong. It's just that really getting a picture of what's going on in terms of exits of private equity deals, particularly smaller deals at a systematic level, is just something that's very hard. And it's likely that there's a lot more activity that is just simply below the radar screen. A second thing is this argument they make that the quality of exits has deteriorated. And in particular, they make a big deal about the second largest category of private equity exits, which is not the sales, trade sales, but essentially sales to other private equity groups, right? Some of these are called secondary buyouts, pass the parcels, private equity to private equity, sponsor to sponsor deals. Choose whatever label you want for these things. And the general, and it's not surprising that there are a lot of these things, right? You go back to the work that Steve Kaplan and Per Stromberg did when they looking at the demography of private equity. There are a lot of these deals, but they, sort of pretty strongly through the paper sort of imply that these kinds of transactions are lower quality and problematic in some ways. And this seems, I guess I just found myself struggling to say, why is it that these things are problematic? Certainly, if you look at the studies of performance, and I pointed to this George paper that was in the Journal of Financial Economics, which Ludo Palpu, who is certainly no friend of the industry, was a co-author on. And they found that basically the secondary buyouts had a return of 1.58. They basically public market equivalent of 1.58, that they did essentially almost 60% better than the equivalent public market index over that time. You might say, well, that's, what about fees and so forth? And even there, when they sort of looked and tried to net out the cost of fees, secondary buyouts still, the LPs were ahead in terms of where they were. When you look at our stuff that we've done using the, the sort of census, IRS, Dataverse, looking at productivity, job losses, and so forth. First of all, the secondary buyouts are among the strongest, not quite as strong as the private-to-privates, in terms of actually creating jobs rather than destroying them, unlike public-to-private deals, for instance. And secondly, that you see that if you look at the productivity of those firms, how much, labor productivity or total factor productivity you look at, the secondary buyouts also increase productivity, not as much as the original ones, but I also have some benefits. So to sort of jump and say, well, there are a lot of these deals, so they must be, and they're problematic, I found myself sort of struggling a little bit to go with that conclusion. The third thing is there should be disclosure. And I think there's a whole conversation we could have about, flows of 401k money into private equity and so forth. Let's just put that on the side just because I've got 2 minutes rather than 2 hours for now. But there's certainly, I certainly had some hesitancy here for 2 reasons. One of which is that they cast in pretty broad sweep saying the disclosure which is being done is low quality. Now, most of the stuff that I do in terms of real world or advisory work is either with some of the large asset owners or else some of the funds which are interested in sort of presenting stuff. And it's very striking how much of an increase in the quality of financial disclosure there's been, that basically all these sort of measures like the public market equivalent that I talked about earlier, that was, in that case, developed by Steve Kaplan and Antoinette Shore, that basically us nerds sort of thought up, have moved over into the real world, certainly among sophisticated GPs and LPs. So to sort of say that this is, and in fact, you could say just as there's been sort of a private equity explosion, as we saw in those charts, there's been a private equity data explosion. It seems every 2 months we're getting a call from another data provider who's sort of tracking this data. But I guess the biggest concern I had was the sort of disconnect between what they were talking about, which is the real problem is all these social issues associated with private equity and what their disclosure was mandating, right? That they, if we're concerned about the social impact of private equity, presumably a lot of the disclosures should be about stuff about social impact rather than about financial performance. And when we think about this, it's really hard, right? And as somebody who has spent, 25 years banging my head against this wall, I guess I appreciate some of the difficulties, right? Looking at employment, you can certainly look at employment, but if you have a firm where the alternative is going bankrupt, cutting jobs is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So how you think about relative benchmarking of this is an important issue. Productivity, right? You might say you want companies to be more productive. On the other hand, if they're doing stuff, right, there's been studies in areas like, for-profit education, which argues that the businesses become more profitable, but the students don't really benefit. If you really want to look at social impact, you really have to have an extremely detailed kind of disclosure. Now, certainly people have tried to do this in healthcare, where there's a lot of public filings, in a variety of airports, where again, there's lots of disclosure, but it's just restaurants and so forth. But it's really hard. And I think, 2 of the papers I cited are examples of papers that both looked at private equity in the nursing home industry. And one of them, the conclusion is private equity is really bad for health of patients. The other is, no, actually it's good. And these are not unsmart people doing these studies or where they did something wrong. They're both refereed papers and so forth. But it just shows how hard studying this stuff is. And to really expect, a sort of disclosure regime to give the kind of information you need to get these kind of evaluations at least raises some concerns. Anyway, I really enjoyed it. Lots of food for thought. And I could certainly go on for a lot more, but since the people who really know something are here, I'm going to get out of the way and leave it away.
Well, it's really great to be here, and I love the paper, Jeff and Dorothy. It's exciting to see coverage from sort of a growing universe of scholars on some of these issues. And my comments, let's see, clickers here. My comments are, so first, I think just acknowledging this is a really important, I think, thought-provoking paper that is reframing, as Dorothy said, an extremely timely issue and one that we've looked at other angles, but this sort of emphasis on capital allocation, I think, is one that's new and important. I am going to sort of frame my thoughts by looking at the history of regulation in this space and how we got to where we are. And I think that might lend some insights into thinking about this question. And then I'll just offer a few questions that I think Jeff and Dorothy could maybe engage with a little more closely. So I'll start quickly by sort of laying out a framework for two versions of the private equity ecosystem. On one end, you might think of a theoretical world where of efficient private ordering, no regulatory intervention, parties are governing themselves, and they demand market accountability from sponsors. And in theory, this has a lot to offer, this unregulated side of the spectrum. Parties, if they truly can fend for themselves, should be able to order their affairs more efficiently than any regulator could. Capital should flow to the best sponsors who should deploy it to improve the efficiency of portfolio companies in the real economy, leading to higher returns, better outcomes, everyone wins. On the other end of the spectrum, you have public company style regulation, mandatory disclosures, substantive rules, litigation exposure, a completely different apparatus. As Dorothy and Jeff note in their paper, exit plays a very important role in the unregulated side of this spectrum working. So why might there be a creep towards the public company world? The efficient, unregulated world only works when you limit the investors allowed in the market to people who can demand accountability from managers. And that means some people in the market get access to higher returns while others don't. It can also constrain the impact of private equity on the real economy to the extent that we think private equity can increase efficiency in the real economy. Less capital in the market limits that impact. There's also the challenge of identifying who can actually fend for themselves. So as Dorothy and Jeff mentioned in the paper, institutional investors often have significant agency problems. Sometimes it's the biggest institutions that have the worst conflicts. There are also coordination problems, systemic risks that private ordering doesn't necessarily solve. So sort of layer on a number of potential issues or deviations from this ideal private ordering world, which has led to some drift towards the direction of public company regulation. So I think the question we're grappling with here is where along the spectrum should private equity sit? And it's a dynamic question. I think there's a lot going on, a lot of market forces moving in different directions that can inform that question. So thinking about this from the perspective of where have we been, I think for a long time, there you go, for the first several decades of the industry, it was a pretty unregulated space. There was a substantial exemption from registration with the SEC if you were a private fund advisor. And this started to change around Dodd-Frank. So Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 began bringing private funds into the regulatory kind of perimeter, making them subject to SEC examinations and imposing non-waivable fiduciary duties on them via the Advisors Act. And that was a significant shift in the regulatory approach to private funds. More recently, under the Gensler and William Bird-Thistle's era at the SEC, the SEC enacted a private fund advisor rule that attempted to go further, especially by mandating greater disclosure by general partners to limited partners. And again, I'll just sort of emphasize that this period this rule was primarily about not public disclosure, but disclosure mandated by GPs to their limited partners. So I'll come back to that point. Why has there sort of been this shift, and particularly with the 2023 rule? I did a paper, back to that, where I was interested in figuring out what investors thought about the interventions that the SEC was putting forward, and kind of phrased the question as, because LPs are sort of constantly complaining about the terms in private equity funds, often complaining about the disclosure that they're able to receive. So the question was, if these terms are so bad, why do you accept them? And they pointed to, in this order, these were the challenges that they pointed to. Fear of losing allocation in the top performing managers as kind of their number one concern. General lack of bargaining power. They pointed to the external law firms representing the general partner as having perverse incentive to sort of protect their form LPA and not give on points that may have been efficient to give on. Insufficient market information, sort of going to the theme of this paper. Side letters, distorting incentives. So I think it's interesting just to note that investors were actually very interested in, I think, welcoming of this general effort to have more disclosure as a general movement in that direction. And I think that these answers lend support to a lot of the problems that Dorothy and Jeff have laid out in their paper. So investors were generally supportive. The industry did not like this movement in the direction of mandatory disclosure. The rule was passed, went to the Fifth Circuit in 2023, and the Fifth Circuit struck it down. And it was on the basis of lack of legal authority. So they interpreted Section 211H of the Dodd-Frank Act as giving sponsors authority to impose mandatory disclosure obligations to fund managers when they have retail investors in their fund, but when they have institutional investors, solely institutional investors in their fund, the authority was not there. So here's some language from that decision, again, specifically pointing to, unlike mutual funds, private funds are generally not accessible to retail customers, and as a result, the commission exceeded its statutory authority. So sort of this emphasis on lack of retail investors. It's been kind of a head-spinning couple of years for me, because in studying this space, this was the posture of the industry. This is sort of the approach of the Fifth Circuit. And in a very short amount of time, we've gone from concerns about the impact that additional regulation will have on this space of private ordering to let's bring in 401k money, let's bring in retail investors. And with it is likely going to come regulation. So I think that's really interesting. This is, we have an executive order from President Trump and Department of Labor just within the last few weeks came out with updates to the prudence standard under ERISA regulations to provide a safe harbor. So we're moving in this direction. We're moving in the direction of retail capital at scale. So what's the upshot of this for purposes of our conversation? I think it caused me to ask the question, coming back to this slide, the Private Fund Advisors Rule of 2023 has been vacated, but the next time we have maybe a Democratic administration, the table may be set for, you've got an industry filled with retail investors. And it seems that this is going to be a very different ecosystem, regulatory ecosystem, if and when this question comes up again. So, and again, the emphasis here being on using Section 211H of the the Advisors Act to provide mandate GP disclosure to LPs. So with that in mind, I think it's interesting. It seems to me that that door is opening. This paper is focused on something different and maybe something that goes a little broader than what that discussion was about, public disclosure. My first question that I posed to Dorothy and Jeff is, actually, let me jump to this. They look at public disclosure, and I guess I will defer to William Birdthistle and Norm Champ on the question of authority and some of the intricacies of this having been at the commission, but my sense is that's going to be a tougher hill to climb to get public disclosure. Whereas I think mandating GP disclosure to LPs is probably, the door is probably going to be more open for that, given the entry of retail investors. One reason for that, I think, going under Section 404, Section 404 involves disclosure of information to the FSOC, Financial Stability Oversight Commission, and it has, there are some confidentiality provisions that sort of limit the ability to go outside. So in my mind, and again, I'm interested to hear what William and Norm think about this, it's not clear what the route to public disclosure looks like and how that will go forward. It's not nearly as clear, I think, as the path to mandating GP disclosure to LPs. So with that, my first question for Dorothy and Jeff is, you set out 3 rationales for mandatory disclosure: testing the value creation thesis, sorting high from low performers, preventing economy-wide resource misallocation. And so my first question is, which of these rationales require public disclosure as opposed to GP to LP disclosure? So maybe focusing on that, it seems to me that you might get some traction with GP to LP disclosure. To the extent that you think public disclosure is necessary, I think it'd be useful to know, have you spell out why is it that the LPs aren't able to act on that information and allocate capital efficiently? And if they aren't going to do it efficiently, who in the ecosystem is going to take that publicly available information and translate it into the accountability that you're seeking? I think a clearer articulation of that, given that I think there's maybe a clearer path to getting GP to LP disclosures. I also think, kind of echoing Josh, some engagement with, I think the industry has come some way in GP to LP disclosure with templates and voluntary disclosure, and I think engaging with that, where are the gaps that the SEC can help to fill, would be helpful as well. Another question I have, you engage with the ERISA trustee and mentioned that this public disclosure will allow ERISA trustees to discharge their fiduciary duties under ERISA. And I guess my question is maybe just to reframe that question, even with this increase in information, do you have concerns about the effectiveness of ERISA trustees in channeling 401k funds to alternatives generally? I think Elizabeth Fontenay and I have a paper on where we sort of, it's just a different framing. We're focused on, is this move to retail capital and opening 401ks to private markets a good thing for retail investors, which is different than sort of taking as a given that it's happening. And so I think I would be interested to note sort of just that distinction, because I think it's a different question. Is it helpful for trustees to discharge their fiduciary duties versus is this something that you actually think is good for retail investors? And then finally, the last question I have, and this is again coming out of survey data that I have in my paper with Elizabeth. Is there any sense in thinking about these obligations as not applying across the private equity universe, but would there be pockets where it would make the most sense? So the reason I'm asking that is survey data that we have in our paper, we pose a question to limited partners in the early days of, this is probably 3 or 4 months after the executive order came out on private funds and retail investment in private funds. And we asked institutional investors how they were inclined to respond. What do you think you're going to do about it? And the most common response was, well, we're going to redirect our allocation to private funds that are not targeted to retail investors. We're going to avoid those channels. And so I think it's entirely plausible that we'll see, as this plays out, institutional investors perhaps clustering to managers that aren't taking retail capital, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a place where you actually can have efficient capital allocation and accountability in those funds continuing to function in a way that works well. I'm not optimistic that in retail channels it's going to work as well. So maybe that's a place to focus this, and maybe it doesn't make sense to apply it across the entire industry. So those are some questions. Again, I think it's a really fantastic paper, and appreciate the opportunity to comment. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Jeff and Dorothy for inviting me back to speak here at Columbia. It's been a while. We're up here with this August panel. I kind of feel like I'm the caveman lawyer from Phil Hartman's SNL skit, but nonetheless, I'll give it a go. So, I mean, let me just get to my slides, hopefully. That's not great. Okay. You want? Sure. I'll cede the floor back.
Sorry. Thank you very much for the invitation, Dorothy and Jeff. I should say a lot of what I could say would be similar to what Will is focused on, but specifically I was charged by Jeff and Dorothy to focus a little bit on the question of authority, and so I've started with my conclusion right there at the top. I think the authority issue is going to be a challenge for the proposal. A little bit of this question is sort of like the night before the Oscars. Will win or should win? I think this is a strong argument. Will it win? Almost certainly not in the Fifth Circuit. Let's take a look and see why. So this comes from part 4 of the paper, the proposal to make the mandatory disclosure issue. Is it a good idea? I think it's a good idea. I think I've seen this formulation from Will Clayton before. Congress gave us a pretty straightforward allocation of decisions when it comes to securities regulation. If you'd like to raise money from a lot of people, you should disclose publicly what you plan to do with it. And if you're uncomfortable making that disclosure, you can confine your activities to those who can fend for themselves. What we're seeing now is an industry that would like both at the same time. And as Will, I think, is suggesting, that's almost ineluctably going to lead to greater disclosure. I think this is such a good idea that I tried it, or at least the agency did while I was there. This is the Private Fund Advisors rule, suite of rules, 5 rules that we tried. There were 5 there, but the 2 that I think are most similar to Dorothy and Jeff's proposals are first the quarterly reports. As Will said, these were just proposed from the GPs to the LPs. They would be standardized across the entire industry, but they wouldn't be public. They wouldn't even come to the agency, and they certainly wouldn't be made public. The second was annual audits. Dorothy and Jeff, I think, do a good job of pointing out how much of the fee migration has been away from carry and to AUM. Knowing exactly what the AUM of the fund seems really important if you're making most of your money from it. But that's what 2 of the 5 rules would have done. What was our authority for that? It was 211H of the Advisors Act. If you take a look at that language, it's very explicitly clear that the agency could do that. Authority for this proposal is Dodd-Frank 404. Different language, but similar in some results, in some cases. What were the results on our 211H? The Fifth Circuit vacated it. What's my prediction for what will happen on 404? The Fifth Circuit will vacate it. I don't think that's a terribly bold prediction. On the question of the text, I think Dorothy and Jeff suggest that the text is very strongly in their favor. I think that's right, and I think arguing about systemic risk is a good idea. Systemic risk is almost always considered both by agencies, by FSOC, by courts to be the stronger of the 2 prongs. It seems to be more worrisome that you're going to create dangers that threaten the entire financial system rather than that a few investors here and there or many investors might lose money. So that is probably the more robust line of attack. If you had to choose between the two, I would choose systemic risk over investor protection. I think it's almost always considered stronger. I think also, as a number of people have mentioned, the fact that money is now moving in from retail and retirement into alts makes a compelling case, especially when you see exactly what's happening with private credit, which is a remarkable timing. You restrained yourself, Will, from mentioning this, but the fact that 401ks are being opened at the same time that private credit is having a bit of a dog's dinner for the last year or so is really kind of too on the nose. I don't think that's going to outweigh some of the challenges. So even if you're arguing that the text provides you with a systemic risk basis for making these proposals, your characterization, I would say, of systemic risk is not the one that typically comes to my mind. I think if I'm capturing it properly, a lot of what you point to, Jeff and Dorothy, in your suggestion of systemic risk is that there could be a large-scale misallocation of investment in our economy. When I think about systemic risk, I think about things like there's a maturity mismatch that's going to lead to run-like activity, and there's contagion, and there's channels of propagation of the systemic risk throughout our financial economy. Seeing or hearing that there is just a general misallocation of the assets in our economy, to me that feels more like maybe a temporary Schumpeterian problem that the economy will work out. It doesn't scare me. Private credit is more scary, and other versions of systemic risk, I think, can be. I'm not suggesting that there isn't that argument there to be made, but if you would like a suggestion, I would make the suggestion that you look for those channels of propagation, you sort of point out exactly what the systemic risk could be. Confidentiality is a bigger issue, I think. So blue, I think, is in your favor. Red, I think, is a challenge for you. So Will did gesture to this. 404 has a large provision on confidentiality. And I won't speak for Norm, but I will say that one of the more memorable events of being in the agency was being provided with Form PF data. I think we are both provided our PF data by the same person, a really terrific civil servant by the name of Tim Husson. It took 6 weeks before I got to see PF data, and it came with essentially the email equivalent of Fort Knox and chains and boxes around it. PF data are considered the crown jewels of the Division of Investment Management, maybe the whole agency. For a pretty good reason. Industry is terrified that that information will get out to competitors and to the rest of the industry. So I'm not sure you can ignore the confidentiality language of 404. There's even a particular provision on proprietary information. I'm certain that the industry would say that information is proprietary, and just as PF data needs to be under wraps, taking this information and making it public is terribly, terribly threatening. If you look at the language from dissents along the way from Commissioners Peirce and Ueda, a lot of it is about the concern with PF data leaving the building. You're suggesting I'm doing just that. So I think you will face headwinds on that, both textually because there's a confidentiality provision in 404, but just as a policy matter because it has never been done before. And as I say, my impression from the agency was that everyone there considers PF data to basically be crown jewels. What do I predict the result on your 404 argument will be? I think the Fifth Circuit will vacate it. Why do I think that? I think that because that's exactly what we went through in 23 and 24. The Fifth Circuit was presented the improbable circumstance of having Antonin Scalia's son say, ignore the text of 211H. The text was very capacious. It said that the agency could do it. And the Fifth Circuit said, why would you think we're textualists? And they looked beyond it to the congressional intent of the fact that that language appeared in a retail section of the Dodd-Frank promulgation. As Will said, yeah, that I think is something you can look forward to happening again. Certainly this rule, your rule, will not be promulgated anytime in the next 3 years, but even if it were, I think you could bet your house on the fact that the industry would challenge it immediately in the Fifth Circuit. It's one of the problems, it's one of the sort of systemic, dare I say, issues of rulemaking and financial authority these days. Maybe from both sides. We'll find out when the current administration's rules come to market. We will see whether or not there will be other industry groups or plaintiffs that will bring challenges based on the new suite of both statutory and constitutional authority to challenge things as being major questions. And it's not hard to find a sympathetic circuit. You only need to find one. And there are definitely ones that are more sympathetic to progressive arguments, and of course the Fifth Circuit is very comfortable hearing ones from the other side of the political spectrum. So It just seems very difficult, and this is a very large question. I think it's beyond the scope of your paper, but I think all papers would benefit from thinking a little bit about this. Are we basically putting financial rulemaking aside now? That seems like a large decision for a federal government that is filled with a dozen federal financial regulators. But it does seem to be a sort of an intractable problem. I have a hard time seeing how any material regulation is going to survive for very long. The tools are so capacious for striking them down. The circuits seem very comfortable doing so. Again, I suspect that may be from both directions, but it certainly was true with these rules. What does that leave? It leaves litigation. I think the standard epithet that we heard in the past was that, well, that's just a regulation by enforcement. I confess I don't really understand that epithet. Most of the cases that were brought that were accused of being regulation by enforcement were won by the agency. If you're bringing cases and winning them, then you're just enforcing. That's just enforcement. I don't think this agency will bring a litigation anything like what you're talking about, but I'm also not sure that a subsequent Democratic or otherwise left-leaning administration would bring one, because there's not really a particular challenge that can be mounted. But that doesn't mean that I don't think litigation will be a fruitful avenue. I think it will, but I think it'll just, generally speaking, be private. We already saw the equivalent of product liability litigation brought for social media. I think with the expansion of retail and retirement assets into this space, it will not be difficult, and we've already seen op-eds in the Financial Times suggesting as much. It will not be difficult for a plaintiff to suggest that the retirees or retail investors who are investing in this stuff simply wasn't fit for purpose. It was very expensive stuff in some occasions, maybe didn't perform as well as advertised in some occasions, and is now being put into very vulnerable areas like lifetime nest eggs. That, I suspect, may be the broader thing. Again, that's quite a bit beyond the scope of your paper, but I would be curious to know whether you think there are existing sources of vulnerability on enforcement proceedings, or whether there should be other ones in future. But as everyone else has said, I'm delighted to see this paper. It's an enormously important topic. Your timing is impeccable. It's only going to become a larger and larger topic as more money moves into it. And this question of whether there is such a thing as fruitful future regulation at the federal level is a very big question, and I think your paper puts it front and center. So thank you.
No.
So it turns out there's one advantage in being the guy that did not get the memo about having slides. So here we are. Well, like everyone else, first off, just want to thank the Millstein Center for inviting me. Thank Dorothy and Jeff for doing the paper and inviting me to comment, and everyone else to comment as well. It's really, I agree with everyone else. I think it's very interesting. And I think it was Professor Lerner who said, there are many things in there that are true. I agree with that. There are facts in there that are true. I think the issue is what conclusions one draws from those true facts that are in the paper, and where one might head based on those facts. Actually, also, I said I would start my timer so that I make sure I stay on time. So I would urge the authors to think about three issues as they revisit the paper. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about exits, and a question that is not put in the paper, which is, why are exits down? Again, to Professor Lerner's point, exits are down, right? But why? And I think that has a major impact on the proposal in the paper. Secondly, to consider that markets themselves are already addressing many of the true things that are said in paper. So I think it would be important for Dorothy and Jeff to think about what are the market solutions that are already hitting the topics that they're highlighting. And third, I want to talk about the proposal itself a little bit and sort of this idea that it's easy to impose something like audited financials that would be disclosed publicly to companies. As William and I think Professor Clayton both said, that is not as easy as it sounds and probably will lead us to the very same problems that have caused the decline in exits. So let's go to the first topic on exits. Again, I think we'd all say it is true that sales into the public markets of private equity portfolio companies are way down. Sales in general of portfolio companies and private equity funds are way down. And it is also true that continuation vehicles, which were sort of roughly referred to here as secondaries, are on the rise. Why is that? So the very same thing that is in the proposal about having audited financials out there in the public, the rules that the SEC has imposed on public companies in this country have essentially destroyed U.S. capital markets, right? So 1990s, 8,000 public companies in the U.S., all your 401ks, you have lots of choice. Now we're down to 4,000, of which around 3,300 are investable. I like to say that the Wilshire 5000 index refuses to change its name, but it was once the 5,000 investable stocks. We're down to 3,300. What does that mean and why? What it means is people in their 401k plans have far fewer choices in investing. The top 10 valued companies in the S&P 500 constitute almost 1/3 of the index's value, right? So I guarantee you that all of us here, non-government employees, are all jammed into the same stocks, right? And they're mostly tech stocks. And if there are any declines in those stocks, we're all going to suffer together. Thus, the push for private assets into 401ks to give investors more choice. Why is the IPO market dead? So Professor Clayton showed Dodd-Frank. The trend began long before that, but Dodd-Frank's probably the ultimate example, where public company disclosure began to be mandated and used for political purposes, right? So Dodd-Frank days, it was you had to disclose extractive resources, so that was an attack on energy. Obviously, under the Biden administration, it was going to be disclosure of climate and so forth. So being a public company has become extremely expensive with these disclosure rules and has become extremely hazardous. Someone mentioned the lawsuits against the public companies, right, are essentially another tax on those companies because the plaintiff's bar files lawsuit after lawsuit on the enhanced disclosure that the SEC keeps imposing. So we have basically not tended our capital markets. The only reason they're really still afloat is that London and Hong Kong aren't a ton better. But the idea of mandatory public company style financial statements being put out by portfolio companies of private equity funds is only going to lead to the same issue, right? And I'll come more to that on the proposal. Secondly, the irony in that exits issue and the chart that was shown, what else was happening in 21 to 25? Lina Khan was in charge of antitrust policy. It was very hard to get deals done, right? So public markets become very unappetizing. Antitrust basically shut down all deal making during the Biden administration. So it's a little ironic to cite that as a reason for more regulation. Yes, we had a burst of M&A last year, and we did start to see some more exits, but no question that they have faded away again. If you think about the idea that we're going to impose more regulation on these portcos, portfolio companies, in order to sort of address the harm that regulation has caused to the deal market and the IPO market, seems very counterintuitive. So I think about that in the paper. My second broad point would be markets are already addressing what is happening, right? So again, no question, fewer exits, longer hold periods, right? That typically crushes returns, right? Because the longer you hold it, often the return is going down. Professor Clayton showed how some LPs and investors may want access to allocations, maybe perhaps worried about bargaining. Well, those days are gone, right? So LPs now have the complete upper hand. Fundraising by private equity has gone like this as exits have gone like this, right? And so LPs are much more powerful. They are extorting many more terms that they want, well, negotiating, I won't say extorting. They are negotiating many more terms that they want. They are represented by the most sophisticated counsels in the world. They are some of the most, tremendously sophisticated investors in the world. They're primarily public pension plans for the government unions. And so they are exerting more power now. A couple other references, right? Someone mentioned mandated disclosure. The Association of Limited Partners, ILPA, has mandated certain reports to investors. If you look at what's happening on the market side, the market is addressing most of the true statements in the paper. So I urge thinking about that. Let's take one example. I do want to clarify for people. There was talk about secondaries as if that was sales from one PE firm to the other. The primary form right now of, let's call it non-complete sales, whatever, are something called continuation vehicles. That's where you have an older portfolio company in a fund, and then it is sent out to a continuation vehicle. The primary investors in those continuation vehicles are actually other limited partners and pension plans. So it's not so much sponsor to sponsor, it's usually the same sponsor putting that asset into the continuation vehicle and new investors coming in. Why? The limited partner pension plans in the private equity ecosphere, right, they're not happy about some of the return profiles available. They're investing less in the poorer performing funds, again, a market sorting that we would all want. Continuation vehicles tend to be the higher performing companies, so I think that was Professor Murner mentioned. No surprise, if I'm going to have 10 companies in my fund and I'm going to tell you a continuation vehicle on one of them, most likely it's going to be a better one, not a worse one. The investors want that, right? So the investors in the continuation vehicles are the same investors in the funds. They want that good asset. And then a major thing that's not true that's in the paper is in continuation vehicles, the managers carry, the private equity managers carry, is rolled and not collected, right? So the idea, yes, carries down, and believe me, if you're at a private equity firm, you're not really happy about that, right? But that's because the LPs are saying, sure, I'll go into your continuation vehicle with a good asset, but you don't have to get to collect carry when that comes out of your fund, right? You have to roll that carry into our new fund so we're all aligned, right? So yes, carry is a little bit down, but it's in a pro-investor way. And then lastly, I want to see where I am on my timer. I'm at 1 minute and 15 seconds. So on the proposal itself of public disclosure of audited financial statements, I would ask Dorothy and Jeff, just think about on this point number 3. It sounds easy. In fact, I think it says it's easy, or you said in your slides, it's easy to have these mandated audited financial statements. I would submit it's not that easy. Yes, some of these companies are audited, but remember, and this would go, I think Professor Clayton said, next time we have Democratic administration, right? GAAP, the PCAOB, President's Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, all of those entities are using requirements for audited financial statements to promote political goals as well, right? So DEI, ESG, all that stuff is being promoted through financial audits. If we make all these companies disclose their financial statements publicly, we're essentially subjecting private companies to the same treatment we gave public companies. What happened to our public companies? They went away. I would suggest the harm to private companies of doing this and the lawsuits that will follow from the plaintiffs' bar does not make this a great idea for something that's trying to sort of broadly address allocation of capital. So lastly, I'd say, when you think about your allocation of capital arguments, I agree with William, which he and I would find doesn't happen very often, that the idea that sort of government is going to think about allocation of assets, obviously government, again, I think we'd all agree is the worst allocator of capital in the world. And by the way, on the conglomerates that you mentioned, market forces ripped them all apart and they went away, right? Didn't work out. Private equity funds that aren't doing well are experiencing, very low re-upping and investing by investors. Their performance is hurting them. And so I don't think getting data from these companies is going to be productive. In fact, I think it's going to hurt the private economy, cause more distortion that we've had in public markets. And so I would
Want to again thank Jeff and Dorothy for having me here, and we'll start off by saying, anything I say here is my own personal view. It's not the view of my firm or any of its affiliates or clients. So when I first read the article and read it through a few times, one of the first things struck me was the sort of assertion that sponsor sales are low quality exits and are just ripe with back scratching. That the idea that a sponsor unaffiliated with the other sponsor, out of the goodness of their heart, would be willing to overpay significantly in order to help another sponsor's exit. And first I thought back to was a deal I worked on about 10, 15 years ago. It was an auction. It was actually a public company, mostly controlled by a sponsor. The sponsor was, fully in charge of all the decision making, and we were on the buyer side. We put a bid in. Our business guys got the call. We won. And they couldn't have been angrier, because the bankers, they didn't ask for more money. And they're like, what the hell did we just do wrong? Like, we must have overbid by so much. They turned to their advisors, and they're like, we have to drive this price down because we are way overpaid. Like, there's no way we can basically be in a position where we've overpaid this much. And that's what we did. I think over the course of, a 3-week negotiation, the price per share dropped like $7. And, sponsors, I don't think they're as ruthless as they were, say, 10, 15 years ago, but they still are, they are very efficiently driven towards price. And the idea of overpaying, is just anathema for obvious reasons. And, the cost to them of overpaying, first, from a reputational perspective, from, explaining it to their LPs, to their own personal pocketbooks. It is a giveaway of, to the extent, you're motivated by carry, which they should be, it is literally giving away 20% of whatever they just gave, 20% is coming right out of their own pockets. Not only that, you're looking at what do you need to achieve? Like, you've got a threshold, you've now raised that. It's not by the same amount, you have to get an IRR on the extra money you just paid. And then you're looking to sort of get your performance. And sort of, we'll just skip over to the next slide. Apologies, really small in front of me. I'll put the slides here. But, it has significant impact. You're talking about, increasing, for an extra, in this example, it's a $100 million equity investment. You paid 110 instead. You've now increased, your need to exit with an IRR has now just jumped almost 25 million over 5 years. You pay 20%, it's almost 50. You've given away 4 million in carry. It is a real problem, and it's just not the way, private equity sponsors work. And it just seemed to me the assumption that sponsor-to-sponsor exits are some of, there are less synergies. It is the most sort of pure evaluation of what this business is worth. You're not sort of driving, I'm a strategic, I represent strategics too, but they are looking at it from a perspective like, well, where are the cost savings? How does this work into my overall strategy? From a sponsor perspective, it's just, what is this business worth? And they're looking at it from that perspective. And I think, sort of saying that's a low quality exit is just flipping something on its head. It's just not the way the market works, and it's just not incentivized by the way that the authors sort of are suggesting that this is sort of a low quality exit, and it's rife with sort of bad faith or just sort of manipulation in valuation. It's not. And I think you sort of can see sort of the breakdown by scenarios here of like how much this really costs them. And it's significant. But I think beyond that is the second assertion. The second assertion, this is, it's just easy. It's just easy. They produce, their financial statements. They already have them, they can produce them. But, the funds didn't produce these financial statements. The portcos did. The portco's CFO, he's managing one portco. He is basically going there with his financial team and producing, to the extent they even do produce financial statements, and to the extent they're audited, that is a huge process in doing that one financial statement for an annual. Now multiply that. Put that at the fund level for one fund. Put that for a fund family. We're talking about, hundreds, maybe even thousands of statements if you're talking at one of the largest asset managers. No one CFO can handle that. Hell, I don't know if 10 CFOs can handle that. So you're talking about a massive undertaking and basically creating a whole new sort of jobs for sort of to try to produce the type of data that is, is not going, and the thing is, it's not for the benefit of investors. I mean, there's all sorts of different private funds. But when we focus on private equity, we're talking about closed-end funds. Closed-end funds are exactly the same. You make one investment decision once. Do you want to sign a commitment letter? You can negotiate that, and certainly funds do. LPs do that as well, and I think, as Norm noted, the pendulum has swung in the last few years quite heavily towards the LPs. They negotiate their terms out. They have massive side letters. They push disclosure. They push representation. But the investor doesn't make that decision. And once they've signed that decision, it's not, we'll put ESG funds aside or things that have specific exclusions. Certain LPs say, well, I can't invest in this and that, and that's fine. But for the rest of them, it's just here's a call letter. You have to produce your capital, send it in, we need it on this date. And that's it for the next 5 years. It's not driven in a way that's sort of, a public market is. You can't, not anyone can come in, and once you're in, it's like Hotel California. It's very hard to get out. You have to sort of wait your turn. And that's sort of driven to sort of like, what is the reason that we need public disclosure if, the investors can't make those decisions, and the LPs already have a huge amount of information available to them. It's not 2010 anymore. They are looking at things, at the high-end LPs, they are seeing everything. It is a very desperate market now for GPs in fundraising. They are looking for capital wherever they can get it, and LPs are seeing the highest quality, GPs go out there, almost full kimono at this point to try to convince them that they are the shop they should go with. I think private comments, mirror what you're seeing in public comments, that, every GP is saying, this is why we're good. This is why we are going to survive in a world where essentially, there's going to be a winnowing of funds, and that this is not going to, it's not going to be just anyone to show up. I used to be at XYZ fund. Why don't you just give me some capital? I'll run with it. I'll produce a good return. That world, just doesn't exist right now. And I think, also, sort of imposing this on portcos, the additional supervision, the additional sort of, confirmation, because again, I think, within GAAP, as anyone who's practiced knows or been in an accounting standard or helped someone, there's a wide degree of, interpretation and application. And for the most, it's not the fund that's basically deciding the starting point here. This isn't venture capital, this isn't angel funding, this is buying companies that have existing revenues that are already operating, even the first buy from whatever private investor, family, founder, whatever, and you're inheriting a set of accounting principles. If you were to basically report this, or have the fund report this across 15, 20, 50, you would almost expect that they'd have to then synchronize those accounting principles. The movement to do that would be a tremendous undertaking that you're asking these funds to do, and it would pose a huge amount of burden and time on the underlying portcos, which primarily in the management teams that are looking, when they're looking at something, they're looking for someone who can help them grow, be synergistic, not for someone who's going to impose a whole new set of burdens on them and distract them from their mission from building value. And I think, as many people pointed out, we are in a self-correcting environment. It is very much so that the lack of, in order to raise funds, LPs are not looking at marks, they're looking at returns. Have you returned capital to me? And that's why every GP I know is when they go to their funds is the moment they have a big return. They want to go to them the second they basically just return capital and say, here, we just performed for you, this is the results, this isn't, on paper, this is in cash. We'd like to sort of have you join our next fund. And the funds who can't do that, the funds that are still just sort of marking things on paper and cannot find an exit, maybe they're raising a continuation fund. They may have high quality assets, but a new fund to go buy new assets, that's hard to come by these days. And then sort of the idea that, what is public, how does public social align with these needs? What is the purpose here? Again, the purpose of the SEC, the purpose of, investors is to sort of obviously regulate the public markets and protect investors who make investment decisions every day, every minute, every moment. We live in this 24/7 investing market these days. But that's for public securities. For closed-end funds, which every private equity fund is, there isn't a moment-to-moment decision. This is a year-to-year, every few year decision. I mean, and of course, we have LPs who are now faced with, the need to continuously deploy capital. And that sort of also goes to sort of exits and timing. That's sort of a longer topic for a different discussion of whether or not all LPs really want quick exits anymore. Most of them we talk to really don't. They have a huge amount of capital to deploy. They can make a commitment that's, and the powder stays dry for years. They are looking for, investments that produce, returns over multiple years, and looking for for sponsors who can produce that for them. So what's here? What's the benefit? I mean, to the extent there's a benefit and the extent there's a need for the information, is this really driven by investors? No, it's really driven by the needs, I think, as Jeff and of deciding whether this is an efficient use of resources. And I will echo Norm's comments of whether or not the government is a really good indicator of that. But putting that aside, if that's the goal, if the goal is to find out, is P being effective? Are they a good manager? Then, is this really a question of public disclosure to the markets, or is this a question of private confidential disclosure to the government and to policymakers who can then sort of decide incentives and, whether or not, P is a good sponsor, all sorts of, tax policies around carry or whatever else you think should drive, private equity decision making. But it's not a real question for sort of helping investors make decisions. And it's really not a question for benchmarking. But let's pause there on benchmarking for a second. So one of the ideas the papers put forth is the idea that this will help LPs. They'll be able to benchmark against other sponsors and see is this a good sponsor? Is it an effective sponsor? I would largely say I think that most of these LPs already have this information, but let's just sort of play that out for a second. If the beneficiary are not the funds LPs, but other investors, other potential LPs, and other funds. So what happens when there's some disclosure that goes wrong? There's some amount of information, there's a misstatement that needs to be corrected. And let's just say, for example, that, obviously there are a number of funds that focus in various sectors. I'll pick technology because that's one of the ones I'm most familiar with, besides financial services. And you have, and I'll just pick one fund, you have Silver Lake. Silver Lake produces, their data for their portcos, they publish it, it comes out, and another investor says, you know what, I think they're showing amazing progress, but their fund isn't open right now, they're not fundraising, I'm gonna go invest in another technology fund. I go invest in Clear Lake or Vista or some other focused fund that does similar stuff. Then Silver Lake has to do a restatement. They have to fix the financials of one of their portcos. Does that mean the liability for that is to any investor who says they relied on that for any other investment? Because it really wasn't for their LPs in the first place. The LPs already had this information. So you're basically inviting a whole new suite of plaintiffs, litigators to come in and sort of say, well, the investors in Vista and Clear Lake and all the other technology funds, did worse than they expected, and but they relied on the accuracy of the Silver Lake portco. So Silver Lake, we're going to now hold you responsible for everyone else's investment. This is sort of the danger in sort of making massive public disclosures that really aren't for the benefit of investors. It sort of expands the universe in a way that's just leads to the inefficiencies and sort of plaguing of what plagues current public markets. So and that comes down to the final point. So is the SEC the right regulator here? I would argue that it's not. I would argue that this is not a question, again, of investor good or investor protection. This is a question, if it is one, of efficiency, of the U.S. markets, the U.S. economy, the global economy, and how resources should be allocated. Again, putting aside any questions you may have about whether that's something that government does well, then that seems like something that would be within the Commerce Department. Confidential findings where governments can then take a look at sponsors. They don't really care if you're a good sponsor or a bad sponsor. They just want to see, is asset management being successful? Is it basically promoting the economy? And then that data, aggregated, anonymized, could then be looked at by policymakers, by macroeconomists, by researchers, take a look and sort of see, is this still an efficient use? Is this causing some of the same problems that conglomerates have? I question, to some degree, whether or not the old conglomerate, conglomerates are the right sort of analogy for what P is, or is it more the modern, we call it, I'd say the modern sort of mega cap companies the Amazons, the Apples, the Googles, who now, operate in 7, 8 different industries, arguably, each, from media, content, to data storage, to cloud, to commerce. This is not sort of that much different than the way our large public companies are now operating. But it is sort of, but it is interconnected in the same way some of our sponsors are interconnected. One of the things I'd like to point out is that, when you think about fund managers, while we have, fund managers, like you would say, your very Blackstone, BlackRock, Apollo, at the end of the day, these are individuals who are making individual investment decisions and really bearing the consequences of those in twofold. I mean, one, when the carry gets distributed, they're going to see the carry from the funds they are managing, not the funds they are not managing. But also, they're going to carry the investment record for the funds they are managing when they continue to raise the next fund, and that might not be under the same sponsor. And therefore, sorry. Okay, I will apologize. Sorry. But so I think, that's sort of, my viewpoints. I appreciate, both Jeff and Dorothy for giving me the chance to say.
Our break time, we're going to give Jeff a few minutes to respond to all these wonderful comments that we've gotten, and if there's more questions from people in the audience, please come and find us during the break, and we can continue the discussion there.
So this has been a quite an illuminating set of responses, and we appreciate that. This is a case where the proponents have given some of the doubters a lot of time. You appreciate. Let me just respond to a couple points. I think one of the things that Josh Lerner said is that struck me is a huge amount of investment allocation is being made on the basis of a limited ability to obtain information about the operating results, the effectiveness of the investments, both in the specific investor protection concerns, but also from, as he said, the social concerns. Obviously, our proposal would not address the issue of jobs or the other social impacts, but we do think the financial and operational results for large large portfolio firms, disclosure of that is very important. Look, the claim of PE from the very beginning is that the governance and incentives models that it put in place would improve results, would make firms more productive and more efficient use of real resources. Disclosure, the non-disclosure element was never a part of the PE case in chief. In the first PE, and indeed the non-disclosure elements have been an accident of how the capital markets have developed. So initially, when the leverage buyouts were first made, in order to finance them, you would need the public issuance of bonds, the junk bonds, right? And so there would be 34 Act and 33 Act disclosure. And indeed, some of the initial important papers reporting the effectiveness of the PE model were based on disclosure of that sort. So after the GFC, in effect, the private creditors, the private credit markets became sufficiently robust that to finance all but the largest deals, you do not need the public issuance of bonds. So all of a sudden, the non-disclosure results after the fact. It's not part of the PE story in chief, and indeed, the fact of non-disclosure permits these firms to free ride on the disclosure of the public firms that are forced to disclose as it is. So there's, a complicated issue there when we start off as disclosure and non-disclosure as a key part of the PE story. On the systemic risk element, I think building that out is an important part of what we need to develop to sustain the authority claim. A expert in private credit, when he read the paper last week, said, you really ought to be pushing the paper as sustaining the systemic, as dealing with the systemic risk of the private credit firms, which is to say, how can they credibly show that the loans that they have made to the portfolio firms are reliable loans, are safe loans, when there isn't disclosure required as to the operating results of these firms. And so, in other words, if the large portfolio firms disclose the fact that they're doing very well, then the credit that they've issued will also be buoyed up. And so the private credit funds that are now facing runs, in effect, will be able credibly to refer to disclosure that actually the credit is good. And so the systemic claim is not just pertaining to the potential misallocation of real resources, but rather the stability of the private credit claims that these firms have received as part of their overall financing. So those are kind of two points. I think maybe I will leave it to discussion with folks in private about this. Let me just say, I mean, to be clear, we are not calling for full 34 Act disclosure on a quarterly basis for these firms, right? It's for the largest firms, annual disclosure, and it's, again, in a fleshed out version of proposal. Of the proposal, it would be essentially financial and operational data, not necessarily the full panoply of the 34 Act disclosure. And I would say that, you know, I don't think that the reason we've seen the diminution of the number of public firms is because of the burden of disclosure. Actually, we've seen consolidation of pre-existing firms because of an environment that is extremely conducive to M&A. Even in the Biden years, the level of M&A was really high in the United States, right? It did not decline because of oversight in any material way. And indeed, in Mark Rowe has written about this. The percentage of the economy reflected by the public firms is still quite robust. And so I don't think it's our disclosure proposal would particularly have a noxious effect on these firms' abilities to grow and to achieve the good results that we want. Okay, so we're now all entitled to a break, and we reassemble at what time?
10 minutes.
In 10 minutes, so quick. Thank you.